In its first iteration, The Legend of Zelda was not the series that we know and love today. In fact, the original title has more in common with the series' most popular titles, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, than any of the other titles that Zelda is best known for. Its design philosophy focused heavily on player freedom, with the intention that the player would be given full freedom to explore wherever they wanted, and in theory, could complete the dungeons in any order. Then, with Zelda 2, a different approach was taken, with Nintendo experimenting with a side-scrolling approach, a method that has been very successful with the Mario franchise, but unfortunately didn't quite suit the identity of Zelda's design philosophy. It was on their third attempt with the franchise that Nintendo would quickly discover the potential of their action-adventure franchise, a game that would cement the structure and identity of Link's adventures to come, and ultimately make Zelda the influential gaming franchise that it is today. In today's video, I want to pose the following question to you. What if A Link to the Past didn't exist? Would Zelda have become the cultural phenomenon it is today? Welcome back to the Zelda realm. My name is Joe, and I'm so glad that you could join me for this week's video. Thanks so much for the support on last week's video. If you want to feature on next week's video, just like these comments have here, all you need to do is comment down below and I'll pick two of my favourite comments to come up on screen with me during this section. Please like the video if you enjoy and subscribe to the channel, as when we reach 1,000 subscribers I'll be releasing my retrospective on Tears of the Kingdom. But for now, let's sit back, relax and enjoy the video. Let's go back to the late 1980s and to a time where console gaming had begun to take off. The landscape of the gaming industry was vastly different to how it is now, and many of gaming's most iconic franchises were in their very infancy. In 1986, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda, which was designed to be completely opposite to that of the game design of Super Mario Bros. The design philosophy was deliberately different, and according to series creator Shigeru Miyamoto, was designed to force the player to think through every decision they made. The first Zelda game is notoriously difficult on a first playthrough, but at a time where the phrase open world game would have been non-existent, I can only imagine the difficulty players experienced back in the late 80s. In a future video we'll go back and look at the beginning of the franchise properly, but one thing I think should be drawn to your attention is the inspiration behind The Legend of Zelda. Miyamoto said he wanted to give players a miniature garden they can put inside their drawer, and drew upon his experiences growing up in Kyoto, exploring caves and forests as inspiration. The Legend of Zelda was always intended to be a more non-linear and free-flowing game, where player choice was key to the gameplay loop. In some ways, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are more faithful to the original design philosophy than any of the others. The Legend of Zelda was a great success for Nintendo, selling 6.5 million copies, and so they were keen to capitalise on its success. Less than a year later, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link was released, and once again was highly praised at the time. Miyamoto very deliberately wanted this game to be vastly different to the first one, and so Zelda was tried out in the side-scrolling world, and played out as an action-adventure RPG of sorts. There are many elements of the Zelda series that we know and love today present here. Zelda 2 introduced spells and a magic meter to the franchise. It also introduced the concept of Dark Link that we would later see in Ocarina of Time and other titles, and the towns in Zelda 2 would later become names of the sages from Ocarina of Time: Rauru, Saria, Naburu, Rudo and Darunia. Poor Impa, unlucky pal, at least you're ridiculously OP in Age of Calamity. It's also the only Zelda game to not feature The Legend of Zelda in its English title. Whilst time has not been kind to Zelda 2, it was a massive success once again for Nintendo upon release. For a sequel at the time, it performed really well, and it was clear that Zelda as a franchise would need to continue. This success allowed Nintendo to set aside a higher budget for the next installment in Hyrule, and timing also seemed to work in the third game's favour. Originally being developed for the Nintendo Entertainment System, it was decided that more time could be spent developing the game to release it onto the SNES, and bringing convention, the game was stored on an 8MB cartridge, double that of standard SNES releases, which allowed for a more expansive Hyrule to be explored. It was also decided that this new release would go back to that of the same style of The Legend of Zelda. However, the capabilities of the SNES allowed for players to move not just in the 4 standard directions, but also diagonally. More time and effort was placed into creating a meaningful story, and this is really where Zelda lore largely began. The desire to feel that same level of freedom was back here. However, the decision was taken to make the game slightly more structured, with players following a desired path rather than being let loose into an unfamiliar world. Once all of this was complete, in 1991, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, changing the Zelda franchise forever. Since I began this channel 12 weeks ago, I've realised that the history of Zelda is much more vast and detailed than I first appreciated, and sometimes I think I take for granted the experiences I've had playing the franchise compared to others. For context, I'm 26 years old and first played a Zelda game in the mid to late 2000s, so I came to the franchise when it was already well established and people knew what to expect. In some ways, I think the shift in design philosophy that we saw in 2017 with Breath of the Wild and the discussions we have seen since aren't too dissimilar to what we might have seen way back in 1991 when Link to the Past first came out. Had the internet been as prominent as it is now, there is no doubt in my mind that A Link to the Past would have been a game largely looked at and debated when compared with Zelda's 2 previous titles. But really, without A Link to the Past, I'm not sure we would have had the Zelda games that we do now in 2025. One of the things I challenge myself to do in these videos is to make you really think about this franchise we love, and to question the details in a way you perhaps wouldn't have done previously. So for this portion of the video, I want you to try and place yourself in the headspace of someone who doesn't know much about Zelda, in an era where console gaming isn't as prevalent as it is now. There have only ever been 2 previous titles that you know about, and you like them, so obviously you're going to buy or rent A Link to the Past and give it a go. And when you do so, you're introduced to all of the following elements for the very first time. The Master Sword first appears here in A Link to the Past, one of the most iconic swords in video gaming. This would be the first time Link would gain its use in the series. Many of Hyrule's iconic locations, including Kakariko Village and Lake Hylia, appear for the first time in A Link to the Past, which would later go on to be series staples alongside the Lost Woods and Death Mountain. The concept of a light and dark world, one that, while not present in every title, certainly plays a role in other significant titles in the series. The game structure of collecting 3 sacred pendants to unlock the Master Sword, followed by saving 7 imprisoned maidens before defeating Ganon. This was the first time the structure that we have come to know and love would feature in a Zelda game. I think it's really important to understand just how significant this is for the context of the franchise as a whole. To us now, these are all concepts that we would either expect to see or have become familiar with over Zelda's many different iterations. But at the time, Zelda was a franchise where each new game was very different to the titles preceding it, and as such, there is no guarantee that these structures would remain in place. The last point is the one I really want to draw out a bit more. The structure of A Link to the Past is timeless, and without its success being realised, it's highly likely that games such as Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess would not exist in the way they do today. The genius of the game design comes in the way the game subtly ups the difficulty without the player really ever realising it, and its first go in A Link to the Past was done in such a way that it became not only a staple for the series, but a trick used in a lot of games we see today. The start of the game allows the player to slowly ease into the gameplay loop and structure of the dungeons, while also having what feels like an achievable goal in place. The player needs to only complete 3 dungeons to get their big reward, which neither feels too daunting of a task or too easy. Once they've done this, and the game opens up to complete 7 more dungeons, the player is likely already hooked and wanting to see the adventure through to the end, while also becoming an expert at the gameplay loop. One of the things that can always be said about the Zelda team is that they are masters of what they do, overachieving and over-delivering in ways very few others have. Their 3 standout titles, which, in my opinion, are A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, and Breath of the Wild, were all the first iterations of that style of Zelda game, but they all built off the back of the others. There are few franchises in this day and age that have the longevity of Nintendo franchises, and even fewer that have delivered so many masterpieces within the same franchise, but yet, somehow, Zelda has done just that. And why? Well, for me, the answer lies in the brave decision making that led to the core design elements of A Link to the Past, which would change the course of Zelda's future. The success of A Link to the Past was huge, not just in audience reaction, but critically too. And as Nintendo began to innovate in the console market too, it was clear that the formula followed in A Link to the Past was a hit. It would be between 1991 and 1998 that The Legend of Zelda would see a slowdown in releases, with just 2 new titles released in the 7-year period after A Link to the Past. Firstly, it would be Link's Awakening that would release on the Game Boy. Originally started as a side project during A Link to the Past's development, this would also end up a hit for Zelda's first portable title. Major story changes were introduced here, and as such, it was very much a one-off for the franchise. But it was the 1998 release that was most similar to A Link to the Past, and really proved that the formula created in 1991's hit was a winner. It's a little known game called Ocarina of Time that released on the Nintendo 64, a console that changed the scope of what was possible for Nintendo in their game design. Ocarina is, of course, Zelda's first foray into the 3D space, and while this was a massive leap into the future for the franchise, the decision was made to keep A Link to the Past's winning formula, and really it shows. If we break down the core gameplay loop, they are virtually identical. Find 3 sacred pendants to begin with, which allows Link to claim the Master Sword, before completing 5 dungeons. With mini dungeons this takes it up to 8, to save the sages and then go on to defeat Ganon. It's a winning formula for a reason, and while the story and use of time travel elevate Ocarina, its fundamentals lie in the game design of A Link to the Past. And it's not just Ocarina that uses this structure. The one I've just described is really what many Zelda fans would call the traditional gameplay loop, when arguing the case as to why Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom fell a bit flat for them. Notably, most people point to the lack of dungeons in these titles, but the point fully stands. I could sit here and talk you through how each title borrows different elements from A Link to the Past. I haven't even mentioned how Twilight Princess explored the alternative realm, but in a 3D title. But it would take me another 15 minutes, and I really don't have time to draw it all out. Suffice to say that if you work your way through the majority of Zelda's mainline releases since 1991, you'll find a library of games that have drawn inspiration from Link's SNES adventure. It was so good that Nintendo had to make a remake of it, but then create an entirely new story and new game mechanic because it's just that good. You're underrated at Link Between Worlds, but I think you're brilliant. Zelda games aren't the only ones that take inspiration from the groundwork laid down by A Link to the Past. In fact, many point to The Legend of Zelda as the design inspiration for many action-adventure games that exist today. There are some games that are very clearly Zelda-like in their design. I instantly think of Tunic for that example, which mixes the design elements of Zelda with the difficulty of a Souls-like. Do not be fooled by its cutesy art style. It is one difficult game, let me tell you. I think what really shows is the number of game directors, writers, and developers that have been inspired by Zelda into taking a career in the industry. While maybe not as big among the younger demographics, it's clear that Zelda still means a lot to those of us who are slightly older. It's a timeless franchise with many incredible adventures that we love to talk about, while also looking forward expectantly to what else the series will deliver. I think it's pretty clear through this video's title and content that I firmly believe that A Link to the Past is responsible for providing the Zelda franchise with some of its greatest moments, but I also believe, having spent considerable time researching and preparing for this video, that The Legend of Zelda wouldn't be the much loved and well known series that it is today without the existence of A Link to the Past. Many people would label Nintendo games as children's games, but with adults enjoying them, with the same tag placed on the Zelda games. But there's no doubting that the first 2 titles are far too difficult to be children's games. It's only with A Link to the Past that the slightly easier structure for the Zelda titles was introduced, making it much more accessible to all. One of Zelda's most incredible strengths is the way in which innovation has always been at the heart of the franchise. Every game brings something new to the table. There truly are no 2 Zelda games that are the exact same in nature, and I think sometimes that can be lost on us as fans. What A Link to the Past brought to the table has remained the foundation for almost every Zelda game since, and was undoubtedly part of the reason for the success of Ocarina of Time. Now don't get me wrong, there was a huge level of work needed to translate that formula across to 3D, especially in making complex and well designed dungeons, which ultimately Ocarina houses some of 3D Zelda's best. But the structure of Ocarina is so similar to A Link to the Past that for me, I feel it's essential that we understand the importance of Link's SNES adventure. If I've done anything in this video, I hope that I've been able to help you think about the series' roots slightly differently. For certain generations, I'm almost certain that A Link to the Past wouldn't even come into the conversation for the best Zelda games, and I implore you to pick up Switch Online if you can, and play through A Link to the Past if you haven't already. And for those who have played the game before, why not comment your thoughts down below? Did A Link to the Past truly change the course of Zelda's future? I'd be so interested to hear your opinions on this, so get involved. That's all for me this week. If you enjoyed this video, could you please give it a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a weekly upload. I'll be back next week looking at an element of the Wind Waker you might not be fully aware of, but for now, please enjoy this video that's popped up on screen, and I'll see you next week.